Imagine walking home in the autumn of 1945. You have just come back from a war that took years of your life. Your city is in ruins. The street where you grew up no longer exists. And somewhere, on a patch of open ground that used to be a bomb site, there is a small house waiting for you. It is not much to look at, boxy, grey, built in a factory somewhere in England and dropped onto a concrete slab in a matter of days. The government told you it would only last 10 years. That house was never supposed to matter. It was never supposed to be remembered. It was a stopgap, a patch, a promise made quickly because Britain had run out of time and run out of homes. And yet, 80 years later, some of those houses are still standing. Some of them are protected by law. Some of the people who grew up inside them will tell you without hesitation that it was the happiest home they ever had. This is the story of the temporary houses that were never supposed to shape anything at all, and ended up shaping an entire generation of British life. It is a story about desperation, about a government racing against a housing crisis it could barely control, and about ordinary families discovering for the first time what it felt like to have a bathroom of their own. But before you understand why people fell in love with these houses, you need to understand just how badly Britain needed them. Because what happened between 1939 and 1945 did not just cost lives, it cost homes. Hundreds of thousands of them. And what came after was one of the strangest, most ambitious housing experiments this country has ever attempted. Stay with this one. It is not just a story about buildings. It is a story about what people are willing to accept, what they end up loving anyway, and what it really means when something built to disappear refuses to. By the time the war in Europe ended, more than 200,000 homes across Britain had been destroyed by enemy bombing. That is not a rounding error. That is not a statistic you skim past. That is entire streets, entire neighborhoods, gone. Cities like London, Coventry, Plymouth, and Liverpool had been torn open by the Blitz, and the people who survived those raids often had nowhere left to return to. At the same time, something else was happening that made the crisis even worse. Millions of servicemen were coming home. Men who had spent years in North Africa, in Italy, in the skies over Germany, were now returning to a country that could not house them. Many moved in with parents or in-laws, entire families crammed into single rooms. Others found themselves in shared lodgings with no privacy and no space to raise children. Marriages that had been paused by the war were now expected to resume, but there was nowhere for these new families to actually live. The government understood, even before the war ended, that this was coming. As early as 1942, following the worst of the Blitz, a group known as the Burt Committee was formed. Their job was serious and specific. Figure out how Britain could build houses quickly, cheaply, and at a scale nobody had ever attempted before. Traditional building, with bricklayers and skilled labor, would take years Britain did not have. Materials were scarce. Workers who knew how to lay a brick wall were often still in uniform. So the committee looked elsewhere. They looked at factories that had spent the war building aircraft and tanks, factories that understood standardized parts, assembly lines, and speed. If those factories could build a bomber in days, could they not build a house the same way? That question would change the shape of British housing for the next decade. And it started with a promise made by the country's own wartime leader. A promise that sounded almost impossible at the time. In March of 1944, while the war was still being fought, Winston Churchill made a pledge that surprised even some of his own government. He promised that Britain would build 500,000 prefabricated homes within 5 years of the war ending. 500,000. At a time when factories were still making weapons, when steel and timber were desperately needed for the war effort itself, the Prime Minister was already planning for the peace that hadn't arrived yet. This was not a small political gesture. It became law. The Housing Temporary Accommodation Act of 1944 set out a real binding target, at least 300,000 homes within a 2-year window, backed by a budget of £150 million. To put that number into perspective, in today's money that budget would be worth somewhere in the region of £5.5 billion. This was one of the largest peacetime construction commitments Britain had ever made, and it was being planned before peace had even technically arrived. The idea itself was almost radical. Rather than building permanent brick houses that would take skilled labor and years to complete, the government would use the same wartime production methods that had built Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. Aluminium, steel, timber frames, standardized parts manufactured in factories, then transported and assembled on site by teams who did not need years of bricklaying experience. There was even, briefly, an attempt to import ready-made houses from the United States. A design known as the UK 100 was agreed, with plans for 30,000 of these American-built homes to be shipped across the Atlantic. But politics and money got in the way. When the wartime Lend-Lease agreement between Britain and America came to an abrupt end in August of 1945, the cost of each imported house rose sharply, and Britain simply could not afford what it had originally planned: British soil. It was a setback, but it did not stop the program. If America could not supply the houses Britain needed, then Britain would build its own. And what came next would put more prefabricated houses on British ground than anyone had thought possible. Between 1945 and 1949, Britain built 156,623 prefabricated homes. Say that number slowly. 156,623 houses, built in factories, transported on lorries, and assembled on bomb sites and open fields across the entire country, from London to the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. These were not all identical. Several different designs competed for government contracts, each manufactured by different companies using different materials. There was the Archon, built from a steel frame with asbestos cement panels. There was the Phoenix, modeled on a prototype bungalow that had actually been exhibited at the Tate Gallery in 1944, of which over 2,200 were eventually built. There was the Unisacco, made using concrete panels that in one striking detail incorporated waste material recycled from China clay pits. And there was the Universal House, an all-steel design manufactured using the same production lines that had built aircraft during the war. Each one had its own quirks, its own strengths and weaknesses, but they shared a common purpose. They were meant to solve an immediate crisis, and they were meant to do it fast. Sites were often small, holding as few as 9 prefabs at a time, tucked onto whatever spare land councils could find. Some sites were bombed-out plots in heavily damaged boroughs. Others were open countryside on the edges of towns. For the families waiting on housing lists, the arrival of a prefab was not a disappointment. It was often the opposite. On the 29th of January 1947, dignitaries gathered in Wandsworth to mark a genuine milestone, the completion of the 100,000th temporary house built in Great Britain since the end of the war. That is how seriously this program was being tracked, and how seriously it was being celebrated. But here is the detail almost nobody expects. These houses, built quickly, built cheaply, built to last only a decade, were about to become some of the most comfortable homes that working-class British families had ever lived in. And that contrast between how little these houses were supposed to be and how much they actually gave people is where this story turns from a construction project into something far more emotional. Here is what almost nobody who wasn't there expects to hear. From the outside, a prefab looked plain. Boxy walls, a flat or gently sloped roof, no ornamentation. But step through the front door and for thousands of families it felt like walking into the future. Every prefab came with a fitted kitchen. Not a kitchen you had to furnish yourself piece by piece, but one that arrived already equipped. A cooker, a refrigerator, sometimes running on gas and sometimes on electricity depending on what was available locally, and even a fold-down ironing board built directly into a cupboard. There were fitted cupboards in every single room, made from wood, steel or aluminium alloy, so families did not need to spend money they didn't have on furniture. And then there was the detail that changed everything for so many working-class families. An indoor bathroom. A real one, with a bath, a sink, a heated towel rail, and hot running water supplied by a back boiler behind the coal fire in the living room. For families who had grown up sharing an outdoor toilet with several other households, who had never once experienced hot water on demand, this was not a minor convenience. This was luxury. Real, undeniable luxury, delivered to people who had been told their entire lives that such things were not for them. Even the layout felt generous. A standard prefab measured at least 635 square feet, with 2 real bedrooms, a proper living room, and a kitchen large enough to actually move around in. Most were detached, sitting on their own patch of garden front and back, giving children somewhere safe to play, and parents somewhere to grow vegetables at a time when food was still tightly rationed. One former resident, describing childhood memories decades later, remembered her mother believing the prefab was nothing short of a castle. Hot and cold water, a gas fridge, an indoor bathroom with its own airing cupboard. She said her mother never wanted to leave. That sentiment, "she never wanted to leave," appears again and again in the memories of people who grew up in these supposedly temporary homes. Not tolerance, not gratitude for a stopgap. Genuine lasting attachment. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it is easy to assume that anything built quickly, built cheaply, and built to be knocked down within 10 years must have felt disposable to the people living inside it. The truth is almost the exact opposite. Before we go further into how this story ends, take a second and actually subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Every week we dig into real documented stories from British life, the ones that rarely make it into the history books, but shaped how an entire generation grew up, fell in love, raised children, and built a sense of home. If any of this is stirring a memory of your own, of a grandparent's kitchen, a childhood street, a house that no longer exists, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. And honestly, some of the best details in future videos come directly from people like you. And if this story is landing with you, a like helps more than you'd think. And sharing it with a friend or family member who might remember these houses themselves means the story reaches someone who actually lived it. Now, back to the prefabs. Because the emotional attachment people felt to these houses did not exist in isolation. It existed alongside real hardship and real desperation that was still playing out across the country even as the building program rolled forward. Because for every family lucky enough to be handed the keys to a brand new prefab, there were still thousands more stuck on waiting lists, watching other people move into finished homes while they remained crammed into overcrowded lodgings. And in 1946, some of those families decided they had waited long enough. What happened next was not organized by the government. It was not part of any official housing plan. It was ordinary people, tired of promises, taking matters into their own hands. In 1946, a wave of squatting spread across Britain, and London in particular. An estimated 50,000 people, many of them ex-servicemen and their families, moved illegally into empty military camps and disused barracks that had been left standing after the war. These were not criminals in the way the word usually implies. These were people who had been promised homes, who had fought for their country, and who had simply run out of patience waiting for the system to catch up. The authorities largely chose not to intervene with force, evicting 50,000 desperate families from abandoned military land at a moment when the government's entire housing program was still trying to prove itself would have been a political disaster. So for the most part, the squatters were left where they were, unmolested, occupying buildings that were never designed to be homes at all. This detail matters because it shows just how real the housing crisis actually was. The prefab program, ambitious as it was racing against a shortage so severe that people were breaking into old army barracks rather than wait any longer. It also explains why, for so many families, the arrival of an actual prefab with its fitted kitchen and its indoor bathroom felt less like a downgrade and more like being rescued. But it would be dishonest to paint every part of this story as pure comfort and gratitude. The prefabs had real problems too, and residents who lived through the coldest winters of the 1940s and 50s remember them clearly. Insulation was poor by any standard, let alone a modern one. Metal window frames, common in several of the designs, conducted cold straight into the rooms and caused thick condensation to form on the inside of the glass. Former residents described prefabs that were freezing in winter and uncomfortably warm in summer, with the only real source of heat being a single open coal fire in the living room. Life inside a prefab was not some flawless fairy tale. It was, in many ways, exactly what it was sold as: a practical, imperfect, temporary solution. And yet, decade after decade, families stayed. Not because they had no other choice, but because for many of them, no other choice ever felt better than the one they already had. By the 1950s, the government had shifted its housing priorities. Extra funding was directed toward building taller, permanent housing, and successive housing acts poured money into slum clearance programs instead of temporary construction. The prefab program, as originally conceived, was winding down. These houses, remember, had been designed with a life expectancy of somewhere between 10 and 15 years. By the government's own original plan, most of them should have been demolished by the 1960s at the very latest. That is not what happened. Families who had moved into their prefabs as newlyweds in the late 1940s were still living in them as their children grew up, got married, and in some cases had children of their own. The gardens that were meant to help ration-era families grow vegetables during a temporary emergency became decades-long projects, tended and expanded year after year. Neighbors who had been placed on the same small site, often no more than 9 houses at a time, became lifelong friends. A community that was never supposed to exist for more than a decade quietly built itself into something permanent. When councils eventually did move to demolish aging prefab estates, replacing them with modern housing blocks, they were met with something the original planners almost certainly never anticipated: resistance. Real, organized resistance. In Moseley, Birmingham, residents of a row of Phoenix-designed prefabs on Wake Green Road fought to save their homes rather than accept redevelopment. In Catford, southeast London, residents of the Excalibur estate did the same, standing outside their Uniseco bungalows with protest banners rather than hand over the keys. These were not people clinging to nostalgia for its own sake. These were people defending the first real home many of their families had ever known. A house with hot water. A house with a bathroom that didn't require stepping outside in the middle of winter. A house that, whatever the government had originally intended, had become theirs in every sense that actually mattered. And in a twist that the Burt Committee could never have predicted back in 1942, the protests eventually worked. The temporary houses that were meant to disappear quietly into history instead forced history to notice them. In 1998, something happened that would have seemed almost absurd to the men who designed these houses 50 years earlier. 16 of the Phoenix prefabs on Wake Green Road in Moseley, Birmingham, the same estate residents had fought to protect, were officially listed at Grade 2 by Historic England. That listing is a formal, legal recognition of architectural and historical significance. It is the same protection given to centuries-old churches and manor houses. And it was now being given to a row of prefabricated bungalows built in a matter of days back in 1945, out of steel frames and asbestos cement panels, originally intended to last a single decade. 11 years later, in 2009, 6 surviving Uniseco bungalows on the Excalibur estate in Catford were given the same Grade 2 protection. The very houses residents had stood outside with banners refusing to leave were now legally safeguarded against demolition. The temporary had become permanent. Not through neglect or bureaucratic delay, but through official acknowledgement that these houses genuinely mattered. Today, an estimated 8,000 prefabs are still standing across Britain. Some still lived in by the original families, who moved in as young couples in the 1940s, now elderly, and others by new generations who have fallen in love with the same design all over again. Owners of some of these houses have their own affectionate nickname for them, passed down through the decades: tin palaces. Not tin shacks. Not temporary boxes, palaces. Think about what that really means. A house built out of wartime production leftovers, planned with a shorter lifespan than a family car, ended up outliving the very government department that built it. It ended up being protected by the same legal framework that guards Britain's most treasured historic buildings. It ended up being the house that an entire generation of British children grew up calling home, the house they remembered decades later with more warmth than many people remember far grander places. There is a lesson buried inside this story that has nothing to do with construction methods or government budgets, and everything to do with how people actually experience their lives. The families who moved into prefabs in the late 1940s were not given a promise of permanence. They were given a stopgap, a patch, something explicitly described as temporary from the very first day they were handed the keys. And yet what they built inside those walls, the birthday celebrated in a living room barely 14 feet across, the vegetables grown in a garden meant only to ease wartime rationing, the neighbors who became lifelong friends on a site with room for just 9 houses, none of that was temporary at all. None of that had an expiration date attached to it. That is the real transformation at the heart of this story. It did not happen to the buildings. The buildings, in the end, mostly stayed exactly as they were built. Steel frames and asbestos panels and fitted kitchens from 1946. The transformation happened to what those buildings meant. A house that started as an emergency measure became, through nothing more than years of ordinary life lived inside it, something people were willing to stand outside and defend with protest banners. Something historic England was eventually willing to protect by law. If there is a warning inside this story too, it is this. Do not assume that something built to be disposable will stay disposable in the hands of the people who actually live inside it. The families in these prefabs were told over and over that their homes were not meant to last. They were told this by the government, by planners, by anyone looking at the original paperwork. And they simply decided, quietly and then very loudly when it came to it, that the paperwork was wrong. Between 1942 and 1949, in less than a decade, Britain went from a country whose cities lay in ruins to a country that had built 156,623 new homes using methods nobody had ever attempted at that scale before. Houses built by aircraft factories instead of bricklayers. Houses shipped to bomb sites on the back of lorries. Houses that were never supposed to still be standing when the 21st century arrived. And yet here we are, decades later, talking about tin palaces protected by law, about families who refused to leave, about a prime minister's wartime promise that outlived almost everyone who made it. If this story reminded you of a house you once lived in, a grandparent's kitchen, a garden you grew up playing in, or simply a version of Britain that no longer exists the way it once did, that memory matters. Leave it in the comments. Tell us what you remember, or what your family remembered and passed down to you. This channel exists because of stories exactly like that one. And if you want more of this real documented British history, told the way it actually happened, without exaggeration and without invented details, make sure you are subscribed. Like this video if it meant something to you, and share it with someone who might remember these houses, or whose parents did. Some stories deserve to outlast their expiration date. This one already has.